to welcome all of you, and especially to welcome you tonight to Hartford Seminary and the biennial Michael Rion Lecture. Michael Rion, who is a former president of Hartford Seminary, believes deeply in strengthening the connections between one's religious faith and one's involvement in work and community life. He's a leading authority on morality and ethics and is nationally recognized for his work in ethics training that bridges the gap between theory and practice. Mike founded Resources for Ethics and Management and has served as a consultant and advisor to numerous businesses and organizations, including Hartford Seminary. And Mike and his wife Nancy are here tonight, and I'm going to ask them to stand and ask you to give them a big round of applause. Our speaker tonight embodies the attributes of the Rion Lecture: to bring to the seminary a person who has made a significant national contribution in the relation of faith to ethics in public life. Bob Edgar fits this definition to a T. Bob arrived at Common Cause in 2007 with a long history of leadership and public service that included 12 years in Congress. He was the General Secretary of the National Council of Churches prior to assuming the position of President and Chief Executive Officer at Common Cause. Bob was elected to the U.S. House of Representatives in 1974, representing the 7th Congressional District of Pennsylvania. During 6 terms in the U.S. House, Bob led efforts to improve public transportation. He fought wasteful water projects and authored the community right-to-know provision of the Superfund legislation. He also served on the House Select Committee on Assassinations and investigated the deaths of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and President John F. Kennedy. In 1986, Bob ran unsuccessfully for the U.S. Senate against now Senator Arlen Specter. That race fueled his frustration with the undue influence of money in politics, and he became an active supporter of clean elections and campaign finance reform, issues that have long been Common Cause's hallmark. Prior to being president of Common Cause, Bob served on its national governing board. An active volunteer, Bob sits on the boards of several organizations, including Families USA. He has a bachelor's degree from Lycoming College and a master's of divinity degree from the Theological School of Drew University, whose tie he is wearing tonight. Bob served as president of the Claremont School of Theology, which is when I first met him, and holds 5 honorary doctoral degrees. He's the author of the book Middle Church. It is my privilege and pleasure to welcome Bob Edgar. Please join me.
Howdy, I'm wearing this tie because my other selection was the tie that you're wearing down there. Nice tie. Heidi, it's great to be here. It's great to have a chance to speak. This particular seminary has had a great place in my heart. When I became General Secretary of the National Council of Churches, I thought that was an important job. But my dream job was to be head of an interfaith institution, because I think that too often we focused on ecumenical work and not enough on interfaith work. And the roots of this seminary are really in ecumenical and interfaith relations. So you're all to be congratulated. Give Heidi another round of applause. And while you're applauding, let me just introduce Sherry Quickmeyer. Sherry, stand up and wave. Sherry is Common Cause Connecticut. There are a couple other people that I would like to introduce, but I won't take too much time with everybody I know in the room. But one person, Skip Powers. Skip is here. if you want to really know about Bob Edgar, Skip was my messenger when I got elected to the United States Congress by accident in beautiful downtown Delaware County, Pennsylvania. And she stayed with me for 12 years. Skip, stand up so that we can... She's one of the few staff people who articulately told me no on several occasions. And did a really good job. What I'd like to do tonight is I'd like to tell you a really bad joke, because they're stuck down here, and I get one out in each of my speeches. And then next, I want to give my lecture in 3 sentences. You're going to help me with that. And then after I share those 3 sentences, I'm going to take 45 minutes to explain it. Okay? First, the really bad joke. Do all of you know Davida Foy Crabtree out here in front?
I'm the really bad joke.
Davida's not going to tell you this, but she served on my board of trustees when I was president at Claremont School of Theology. And one day she told me that she was traveling around the mountains of California with Father O'Malley. And Father O'Malley was driving, and Davida was sitting next to Father O'Malley. And they were driving up into the hills. They went up past Big Bear and Arrowhead, and there was a twisty, windy road there in California. And as you know, Davida, you can imagine she was talking, and the priest was talking as well. And they were talking and driving. They came around the corner. You're going to have to help me with this. Can you all moan? Oh. Came around the corner and they ran over a rabbit. They were really upset. They pulled the car off to the side, and Father O'Malley and Davida got out. They ran over, and there's the rabbit, completely flattened on the highway. And after a few seconds, the priest reached into his pocket, pulled out a flask, sprinkled it on the rabbit. And the rabbit puffed up, jumped up, ran about 5 yards and waved, ran about 5 yards and waved, ran about 5 yards and waved, and went right into the briar patch. And Davida said, "Father, was that holy water?" He said, "That wasn't holy water. That was hair tonic with a permanent wave." I feel a lot better now that we've done that. Could I ask everyone to stand, if you are able, and I want you to put your hand on someone's shoulder, if you are able. Okay, I need to come down here, because I need somebody to put their hand on my shoulder, and I just need you to repeat after me, okay? Lord.
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 Help me.
Help me.
Notice
Notice
the stains
the stains
when people get spilled on.
when people get spilled on.
That's the first sentence. Second sentence. We are.
We are.
We are.
We are.
The leaders.
The leaders
We have been waiting for.
we have been waiting for.
Final sentence. If you want to walk fast,
If you want to walk fast,
walk alone.
walk alone.
If you want to walk far,
If you want to walk far,
walk together.
walk together.
Heidi worked over in Geneva for a while near the World Council of Churches. One of the leaders of the World Council of Churches, Sam Kabia, when he was inaugurated into that position, shared an African proverb, which was the last sentence that you shared. If you want to walk fast, walk alone. If you want to walk far, walk together. When I became General Secretary of the National Council of Churches, you remember that first week, Joan Brown Campbell and I got a call. I was replacing her as General Secretary. We got a call from the Cuban Council of Churches. We were asked if we could come to Cuba and pick up the two grandmothers of little Elian Gonzalez, the little boy who was lost at sea, and bring those grandmothers to the United States to meet Janet Reno, the Attorney General. You can imagine, I had just finished 10 years as president of a theological school, and here I was in my first week being asked to go to Cuba. Well, a plane was made available to us, and I got in that plane and I flew to Cuba with John Brown Campbell, and I made Fidel Castro pretty angry. He wanted us to go to his place, his palace, to gather up the grandmothers and talk to them and then bring them to the United States. Joan was willing to do that. I was not, because this was a church-to-church experience, and I wanted it to be not a government-to-government experience, but a church-to-church experience. So I told Fidel Castro no, that if we were going to see the grandmothers, we'd have to see them someplace else. He made us wait for 6 hours, and I went at midnight with Joan Brown to the Cuban Council of Churches office, and we met the two grandmothers, and we met Elian Gonzalez's father, we met the great-grandmother, we met all of the relatives. These two women had never been off the island of Cuba before. They were delightful people. They weren't sure whether they would go with us or should go with us, but they said they would come back at 9 o'clock the next morning and tell us whether or not it was possible. At 9 o'clock, Elian's father came by and he said, "You can take the grandmothers." And an hour later, we were on a Learjet flying back to New York City. And we got there, we had 300 reporters in a room talking to these women in Spanish and asking questions and screaming loud. During the week with them, I put my arm around one of the grandmothers and I said, "You know, you could adopt me. How strong and courageous you were." And she looked up at me and she said, "No, you're older than I am." I tell that story because it's just one snippet of a series of things in my life that have led me to an intersection of faith and politics. It started pretty early. I was a senior in high school, and the United Methodist Church, in the middle of the day, called my mother and asked if it would be okay if they sent her son to Oslo, to the 10th World Methodist Conference in Oslo, Norway. My mother, who had not graduated from high school, thought it was in the Midwest, did not know that it was in Norway. But the summer of my graduation, at age 18, I went off with a whole group of young women and young men and 8 counselors to 11 countries. And one of the places, we visited Czechoslovakia, we were in England and France and Switzerland and Germany. We went to Czechoslovakia. That was a powerful thing because it was behind the Iron Curtain. You can imagine how my eyes were beginning to open. But the most important experience of that trip was traveling in a bus down in Naples, Italy. We all were piled on the bus and we were going to go visit an orphanage. And we all had pictures in our mind of what we were going to see. But in order to get from where we were staying to the orphanage, we had to go through some of the most tragic poverty that I had ever seen. I have to tell you, as an adult, I've seen worse poverty, but driving in that bus, nose against the window, watching children run around cardboard shacks that they were living in, water streaming in the streets, sewage in the streets, kids playing in that, I just was challenged by the issue of poverty. And then when we got to the orphanage, the doors opened up, the bus went inside the orphanage, and there all of the children were clean, all dressed in colorful clothing, all singing, welcoming these Americans who had come to visit. It was the Casa Materna orphanage that had survived World War I, World War II, and had cared for children after children after children who were homeless, who were abandoned, who were unloved by their families, or just families that couldn't care for them. The contrast between what was inside the wall and what was outside the wall had a powerful impact on me. I think it actually created what you might call, I don't know what you would call it. Is it vocation? Is it God's voice? it just empowered me to say, I want to spend my life focused on ending the poverty that kills. I wear this pin. Someone at the reception came up and asked me about the pin. It's actually my mantra. It works every day except St. Patrick's Day. It's a globe, a peace dove, and a green ribbon. And it reminds me every day that my vocation, and I hope it's your vocation as well, is to address fear, fundamentalism, and Fox News with a commitment to peace, poverty, and planet Earth. I believe that my life, while it started out as a young suburban kid understanding poverty for the first time, and ended up as a member of Congress, an academic, and now head of a good government organization, all of my vocations have been all to address ending the poverty that kills, healing the earth, or working on peace and nonviolence. The vocation didn't change. I went to theological school. I served churches in the coal regions. I know about church work. But I was empowered by people like you who inspire young people to think about religious vocations. I was inspired by people who lived the gospel as opposed to simply reading the gospel, who lived their faith as opposed to just reading about it in books. I tell people that I'm really the Forrest Gump of religion and politics. How many have seen the movie Forrest Gump? If you get a chance, go back and see that movie. There are more sermon illustrations in that movie than you can imagine. Do you remember that one scene where Jenny, the love of Forrest's life, is going down a dirt road and she starts throwing stones at the house where her father had abused her, and she falls on the dirt, and Forrest comes up, lumbers up, and sits next to her and says, Jenny, sometimes there just aren't enough rocks. I thought of that Luke scripture that talks about the church leaders of Jesus' time telling him to get his disciples to be quiet. And he says, if they are quiet, the very stones will cry out. But think about that movie. Forrest is always ending up next to famous people. That's sort of my life. I was a senior in theological school at Drew University. And by the way, I served on the board of trustees at Drew University. I wear their tie. They turned me down as an undergraduate. I feel really good when they finally accepted me, put me on the board. But I was a student at Drew. I was the wrestling coach at Drew. I, in high school, majored in football, wrestling, and track, so I was really interested in athletics. But a guy by the name of Bill Coffin, who some of you probably know, Bill was chaplain at Yale at the time, and he gathered a group in Washington in February of 1968 of laymen and clergy concerned about the Vietnam War. I loved Bill Coffin. Later took him to Central America with me. I'll tell that story in a little while. But Bill had us all at the New York Avenue Presbyterian Church in Washington making the connection between poverty and war. To get there, we got on a bus in New Jersey and traveled down through Delaware and Maryland and up next to the church in Washington. And the Jerry Falwell of that day was a guy by the name of Carl McIntyre from Cape May, New Jersey, carrying a huge sign that said, "Kill a commie, for Christ's sake." Speaker after speaker came and spoke at the podium and told their story and made the connection. My wife at that time, same wife I have now. I tell people I've been married 47 years to 4 different women, all with the same name. My wife was furious at me. Why would you question your government? But there was something about Bill's invitation that captured my attention. And so I went up into the balcony, and I listened to speaker after speaker show the connection between the violence of Vietnam and the poverty in the streets. The last speaker was this 39-year-old clergy person who came up to the podium to speak. And it was Dr. Martin Luther King. It's 5 weeks before Dr. King is killed. Dr. King took the podium. I have a couple of the speeches, not that he gave that day, but he gave 1 year earlier at Riverside Church, where he made the conversion to understanding connections between his faith and commitment to the poor and the issue of war. He repeated much of that speech on that day in February 1968. Here's something he said. He said, "We're now faced with the fact that tomorrow is today. In this unfolding conundrum of life and history, there is such a thing as being too late. Procrastination is still the thief of time. Life often leaves us bare, naked, and dejected with lost opportunity. The tide in the affairs of humanity does not remain at the end, at the flood, it ebbs. We may cry out desperately for time to pause in her passage. Time is deaf to every plea and rushes on. Over the bleached bones and jumbled residues of numerous civilizations are written the pathetic words, too late." He closes that comment by saying we still have a choice today, nonviolent coexistence or violent co-annihilation. This may well be humankind's last chance to choose between chaos and community. Dr. King said something else that has stuck with me over the years. He said, "You and I will have to repent in this generation, not merely for the hateful words and actions of bad people, but for the appalling silence of good people." 5 weeks later, Dr. King was killed. And less than 10 years later, I was chaplain at Drexel University. I had founded a shelter for homeless women in the city of Philadelphia. I was committed to being an urban pastor. And then something happened on September 20th, 1973. Remember what happened that day? I'll give you a hint. It was a Saturday night. Remember what happened that day? It's called the Saturday Night Massacre. A guy by the name of Richard Nixon, who was president of the United States, summarily dismissed Archibald Cox, who was the special prosecutor looking into the Watergate experience. I was sitting home and I saw that happen. I couldn't believe that somebody being investigated had the power to fire the investigator doing the investigation. I looked the word Democratic up in the telephone book. Skip will tell you I lived in Springfield, Delaware County, Pennsylvania. I discovered in the months following, in November, December of 1973 and January 1974, that the last time a Democrat had won an election was in 1858, that there were 210,000 Republicans and about 90,000 Democrats in the district, and that the candidate who ran in 72 had lost by 42,000 votes. I went around and asked the Democrats who they were going to run for Congress. I had never taken a political science course. I had never been to Washington to watch a legislative session. The highest office I held was being vice chairman of my son's parent-teachers organization. But I couldn't find anybody to run for office. Everybody was so pessimistic about what could happen. On the 4th of February 1974, I announced my candidacy. I ran in a primary. I had a primary opponent. He got 3,000 votes. I got 6,000 votes. I raised $3,000 and won the primary. Republicans had a primary. They spent a little bit more money. One got so huge a response, he put a deposit on his house in Washington because no Republican had ever lost. But then in June and July, the Watergate hearings were there. Ehrlichman, Haldeman, John Dean were all on television. Then in August, Richard Nixon resigns. And I got elected by 19,000 votes at age 31. One of the Watergate babies. With 75 Democratic freshmen, 17 Republican freshmen. We were the original Tea Party. You think of the Tea Party as being conservative, and the new Tea Party is, but we did some things as, people like Chris Dodd and Toby Moffett from Connecticut were part of that class. 75 Democrats, 17 Republicans. We unseated 5 committee chairs. People like Wilbur Mills, who had fallen into the tidal basin. Wilbur was chair of the Ways to Be Mean Committee. We were angry. We unseated the chair of the Armed Services Committee and the Banking Committee. And we just thought we had power. In April of 75, there we were on the House floor, 22nd of April, shutting down the Vietnam War. We thought we had power. We worked on the first energy bill. We thought we were going to see energy conservation. We were going to have automobiles that could be driven without using fossil fuel oil. We had the resource recovery legislation, and as we said, the community right to know provisions of Superfund. Heidi said that I lost the Senate race. I don't think of it as that. I came in second. I got the silver medal. But I learned something about being an elected official, and it gets to one of the points that I made. First point that I made you focus on was, Lord, help me notice the stains when people get spilled on. If we could vaccinate every young person to understand that we have to live on this planet Earth together as brothers and sisters, if we could get every young adult to recognize they shouldn't spend all of their time seeking money, but some of their time sharing that resource with others. If we could give people a living wage, not a minimum wage. If we could lift all of our boats in a way that would care for the least of these, our brothers and sisters on planet Earth. If we could notice the stains when people are spilled on, we'd live in a better world. Maybe it's time for us to critique capitalism. You know, capitalism is the last surviving economic system, but it doesn't mean that you can't critique it. And up until 2008, when we had the economic tsunami, you couldn't touch critiquing capitalism, or you were labeled somehow a communist. Well, maybe it's time for us to fine-tune capitalism so that it's not based on having a percentage of our people unemployed and a percentage of the world's population enslaved. And maybe we need to think about, what does democracy look like 50 years from now if we, in fact, were really serious about being the kind of nation that some of our founding fathers and mothers had intended. Lord, help me notice the stains. But the second thing I made you think about was, we are the leaders we've been waiting for. I hung out with House members and senators and presidents, and I got to tell you, my experience, and maybe this is different than yours, maybe it's different than even Skip's, my experience is that Congress doesn't lead, it follows. It gets pushed from the bottom up. It didn't deal with health care simply because there was a pressure from the top. It dealt with health care because too many of our people have no health care. The push comes from the bottom up. We learned this in the Civil Rights Movement. Dr. Martin Luther King had a majority for about 30 seconds when the Civil Rights legislation passed and the Voting Rights legislation passed. But, you know, it was a small group of blacks and whites who stood up when others told them to sit down and spoke out when others told them to be silent that made the difference. My belief is that we need to recognize that power comes from the ground up. I'm happy that people are occupying Wall Street and Washington and Los Angeles and Boston. I'm happy that people are taking to the streets. Unemployed persons, students who have extraordinary loans for their college and university education, taking to the streets to balance what we've heard for the last years about the ultra-conservative Tea Party who wants to go in a different direction. I want those young people and young adults and senior adults to stand up and speak out, because that push helps to set the stage. And I want the elected officials to begin to listen. We are the leaders we've been waiting for. I had an incredible experience while I was in Congress. You heard about my serving on the Select Committee on Assassinations. I interviewed James Earl Ray at the Brushy Mountain State Penitentiary, so I know a lot about the King assassination. I spent a lot of time on the Kennedy assassination. I also spent time on Central America. Do you know what happened in March of 1980? An archbishop in San Salvador was holding up communion wafers and was assassinated. Archbishop Romero. That happened in March of 1980. Do you know what happened on the 8th of December, 1980? 4 religious women were killed in El Salvador. 3 had just flown over to San Salvador from Managua, Nicaragua. They'd been driven to the airport in Managua by Sister Peggy Healy, a Marinol nun. And when they got off the airplane, They got into a van with another sister, and as they were driving away from the airport, they were captured and killed. Ambassador Bob White, the ambassador of El Salvador, was the one who found their bodies. I was asked by the Unitarians up in Boston to go with Barbara Mikulski, who's now senator from Maryland, and Gary Studs, a former congressman from Massachusetts. We arrived in Costa Rica, Nicaragua, and Honduras, starting on the 8th of January, 1981. We had about 3 days to prepare for the trip, to investigate their deaths. We went into Costa Rica, a beautiful place. Members of Congress lust after Costa Rica because it has neither a standing army nor a Senate. So House members loved Costa Rica. Went into Nicaragua and I met Peggy Healy. Peggy Healy was a fascinating woman. She taught me magic tricks. She taught me this one about how to lose your thumb. She taught me this, how to... Remember, you have to be there. But one of the things that I discovered in my trip in Nicaragua and Honduras, this is 1981. This is right before Ronald Reagan becomes president of the United States. What I discovered is that our State Department, Defense Department, because of the separation of church and state, were not teaching State Department employees about the impact of religion in what was happening in Central America. I remember going into the embassy in Honduras, and the embassy officials gave us a briefing on what was happening in the Contra War and also the war in El Salvador. Said nothing about liberation theology, nothing about the role of the Marinol and the Jesuits and others. And my shorthand coming away, given my religious background, was the meek shall inherit the earth, but there are two interpretations of that. The landowners said the meek shall inherit the earth, and the meek will get their inheritance at death. So between birth and death, the meek got to keep their mouths shut. And the landowners loved the conservative Catholics who had people worshiping Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, had them in small groups, had them praying for their salvation, had them praying for what would happen in the afterlife. But they were also given another interpretation of that passage by the Marinols and the Jesuits, who were telling peasants that the meek shall inherit the earth, but the meek have a right not to be raped or tortured or beaten now, and the meek have a right to a quality of life. What you guys were hearing up here was this was all Fidel Castro. It was all Cuban Marxist, Leninist ideology, that it was the Russians that were invading through Central America, and that was what was happening. But what was there was simply a conflict between landowners and the have-nots, the poor peasants that were there. One experience that I had was when we got into Honduras, I worked with the UN Refugee Relief Agency. When I went to the embassy, they said there are 15,000 refugees up in the hills being helped by the UN. So I called the UN on the phone and flew up to a border line between El Salvador and Honduras. There were 35,000 refugees up in the hills being helped by the UN Refugee Relief Agency. The following September, this is January, following September, October, they won the Nobel Peace Prize for their work in responding to those persons. But the contrast between what was happening in the embassies, what was known in the embassies, and what was actually happening on the ground startled me and made me think that maybe we shouldn't be supporting the Contra War. Maybe we ought to be working on peace and nonviolence. Again, I feel a little bit like the Forrest Gump of religion and politics. But I say all of this because the folks that I've met over time inspire me. Listen to the words of Archbishop Oscar Romero. Here's what he said, which I think helps us figure out the role of politics and religion. He said, "We plant seeds that one day will grow. We water seeds already planted, knowing that they hold future promise. We lay foundations that need further development. We provide yeast that produces effects beyond our capabilities. We cannot do everything, and there is a sense of liberation in realizing that. This enables us to do something, and to do it very well. It may be incomplete, but it is a beginning, a step along the way, an opportunity for God's grace to enter and do the rest. We may never see the end result, but that is the difference between the master builder and the worker. We are the workers, not the master builders, ministers, not messiahs. We are the prophets of a future, not our own. I share these stories only to say, I have some hopes. I wrote a book a few years ago that took on Jerry Falwell, Pat Robertson, and became Jesus' speechwriter at the end of the book. I suggested 7 new Beatitudes. You might want to take a look. It's a neighborhood bestseller. My kids have all bought copies. But 2 of the Beatitudes, one of them was, blessed are those who read the whole Bible and not cherry pick. And my favorite is, blessed are those with a sense of humor and a sense of hope. If in fact we notice the stains when people get spilled on, and if in fact we are the leaders we've been waiting for, and if in fact the only way to get things accomplished is to walk together rather than simply walking fast and walking past the issues that we face, we've got to figure out how to live much more collaboratively together. That's why it's so much fun and of value to be head of a secular organization right now, Common Cause. We're a secular organization, but I have to tell you, I recently got arrested as head of the secular organization. I have 5 honorary doctorate degrees, but only 4 arrests for civil I only had 4 arrests for civil disobedience. I now have 5. On the 28th of July, I was arrested, praying in the rotunda of the Capitol. Can you imagine? There I was with 10 other religious leaders, former head of the United Church of Christ, Paul Sherritt, the head of the Board of Church and Society of the Methodist Church, Jim Winker. We were represented by the Roman Catholics. A woman there, Jean Stoken, was the daughter of a nun. Think about that. And we had Rabbi Arthur Waskow from Philadelphia, who was there as well. But what we were hearing from the House and Senate members were they were all talking all summer long about deficits and debt. You heard that talk, deficits and debt. Did you ever hear them picture a child who's going to be impacted by the loss of nutrition meals at elementary school? Was there any conversation about homeless people? How about senior adults? How about working poor and those that are underemployed and those who are out of work? Was there really much talk about what the impact of the debt and deficit talk is going to be? We did an interesting thing at Common Cause. On Monday, before my arrest on Thursday, we invited a guy by the name of John Raines, who was a retired ethicist from Temple University, and his wife Bonnie. And if you want a good speaker for this lectureship, ask John Raines and Bonnie to come and speak to you. John contacted me because 50 years ago this July, he was arrested in Little Rock because he was one of the Freedom Riders. And John had gotten on the bus, and he had gone south, and he had gotten off the bus, and they went into a lunch counter and were arrested. They were charged by a judge. They were literally thrown out of town. This past July, the mayor of Little Rock invited John to be the keynote speaker and honored John for his leadership on civil rights. So on Monday, he came and told this incredible story. His wife Bonnie, don't tell anybody, his wife Bonnie also tells an incredible story. She cased the FBI office in Media, Pennsylvania, that was broken into back in 1971, where they discovered our FBI had files on our anti-war activists, and it brought to light some things similar to the Pentagon Papers. So John and Bonnie were pretty progressive. They came and they talked, empowered the staff of Common Cause. Common Cause, founded 41 years ago. We're genetically nice. We're polite. Our core membership are 65 to 102-year-olds who loved John Gardner, who understood John Gardner's vision that everybody had special interests representing them in Washington, but average, ordinary people. And in the 70s and 80s and 90s, we were doing incredible things all across the country. We had hundreds of thousands of members. You know, Common Cause was really that, but it was genetically nice. John comes and talks about this incredible courage of the Freedom Riders. And he's trying to challenge Common Cause to think that in the next 5 years, we're coming up on the 50th anniversary of Selma. We're coming up on the 50th anniversary of Freedom Riders, the Civil Rights legislation, the Voting Rights Act. He's trying to get Common Cause to do a renewal of the Voting Rights Act, not just nationally, but in the states, to prevent deceptive practices around election, to make sure people are registered. I have a crazy idea. I think every baby born in the United States should be registered at birth. We give them a Social Security number. What more do we need to give them? And at 18, what if every school and every veterans hall would give 18-year-olds a ceremony similar to what we give to immigrants? Give them a flag and a constitution and a certificate that now they can take their registration and vote. And wouldn't it be nice if we could get to 80 and 90% of our people voting rather than 50%? And wouldn't it be nice if elected officials served the public interest and not their political interest or the special? Well, that's another story for another day. On Tuesday, after John and Bonnie came and inspired the staff, I'm driving home. And I got a call from my press secretary, Skip. And she says to me, she said, you know, you only have those 4 arrests for civil disobedience. How would you like to get some of your churchy friends to do some action at the Capitol? 36 hours later, we met at the Methodist building. We walked across the campus to the Capitol. As we went inside, we were greeted by Congressman Rush Holt from Princeton, who hugged us and greeted us and welcomed us into the Capitol. Rush was a congressional fellow in my office. It's great to see somebody who's essentially an intern become a congressperson. We had a great time. Then I went upstairs, and a woman by the name of Shelley Pingree greeted us, Congresswoman Shelley Pingree. She was president of Common Cause, and she recruited me to the board of Common Cause. But then she abruptly quit, went back to Maine, and now she sits in Congress, so we have 1 vote in Congress. She greeted us, and as the 11 of us walked to the rotunda, she walked into the house to speak a word of appreciation for the faith community standing up and speaking out a word of justice. We got into the rotunda. There were only 11 of us. There were crowds of people around us. We had observers. The Leadership Conference on Civil Rights was with us. Rabbi David Saperstein from Reform Judaism, he was with us. We had a number of representatives observing. We knew we were going to be arrested, but we also were told we were only going to be arrested if we knelt. We could stand there and talk all day, but if we knelt and prayed, we were going to be arrested. And the funny thing was, when we finally did kneel, one of our people, Paul Sherry, had 2 replacement knees and couldn't kneel. His picture's in the New York Times on the next day because it looks like he's talking to all of us. It's just that he's standing there because he's not able to kneel. And Rabbi Arthur Waskow's in a wheelchair. But I have to tell you, we did kneel and we did get arrested. And we did have to go through a process. And the hearing we had just a couple of weeks ago was amazing. The judge said if he had known that we were going to do that, he would have joined us. We weren't fined. Now, I have a punishment. My punishment is that I can't go to the Capitol building of the United States until the 12th of April, 6 months probation. And I had to take a drug test, so I have a certificate. I have a certificate that I'm drug-free. No fine. They were going to ban us from Capitol Hill. But they sent two different messages. One was Capitol grounds, and the other was Capitol building. We accepted Capitol building because we rarely go to the building itself. But I have to say, if I have one regret in my life, it's that I've not been arrested enough. I wasn't arrested on Vietnam or on South Africa. I just didn't do it. My first arrest was, you'll appreciate this, my first arrest was in Nevada at the test site for nuclear weapons. It was in March of 1990. I had just been elected president of Claremont School of Theology. It had not started yet, and I accepted an opportunity to speak at the Desert Experience for testing nuclear weapons on Palm Sunday. I was arrested in the morning. That afternoon, a very conservative member of the Board of Trustees gave me a party at his home, and he didn't know that I had been arrested. And a couple of years later, I took almost all my student body who wanted to with faculty, and we got arrested again in the Desert Experience, just as a way of teaching people about the spiritual value of it. I was arrested also on the war in Iraq. I took a delegation to Baghdad to try to stop the war that included religious leaders. But we had a great ad in the New York Times. It pictured George Bush and said, "Mr. President, you tell us Jesus changed your heart, we pray that he'll change your mind." But my most spiritual arrest, was on the steps of the Sudan embassy in Washington, D.C. A group of us had read the book, A Problem from Hell by Samantha Power. You get a chance, read that book. She won a Pulitzer Prize for it. She traced the issue of genocide from the Armenian genocide, 1915, through the Holocaust, through Cambodia, through Rwanda, and she discovered that no Western government had ever used the word genocide during the genocide. It's always after that we look back and say, like in Rwanda, 800,000 people killed in 90 days, and we did nothing. She points out all of that. And so our goal for getting one or two people arrested every day for 30 days was a very simple goal. We wanted Kofi Annan, Colin Powell, and George Bush to use the word genocide. Because she reminded us in that book that if you use the word genocide, then you're committed to international rules of law, and you've got to intervene. We did get them to use it. They did not intervene. We did get them to speak. But I want to say, I went up and knelt, and they give you 3 warnings. The Secret Service guard the embassy, and the Secret Service came up and they said, "Reverend Edgar," I had a clerical collar and robe and a stole, "if you don't leave, you will be arrested." I continued to pray, and they came up again and they said, "Congressman Edgar, if you don't leave, you will be arrested." And the third time they said, "Mr. Edgar, please stand up." I put my hand behind me and they put these little plastic handcuffs on. They took me down and they said, "Please, watch your step." They placed me in the paddy wagon. I was in the paddy wagon alone. It's a 15-minute ride to the police station. I knew I was going to be fined $50 and slapped on the wrist for this act of faithful civil disobedience. But I started to hum the songs of the civil rights movement, "We Shall Overcome," and started to think about those courageous people who faced fire hoses and dogs and were willing to stand up and speak out a word of justice. And I wondered, how do we get our people in our country to have that kind of courage to speak on behalf of those who are oppressed? Well, Heidi, that's where you come in. I really think our seminaries need to teach more nonverbal sermons. I think we need to teach our young people that their vocation does not stop when they get their first experience, whether it's a church or a secular position. I think we need to remind people that life doesn't start and end in from one end to the other, that there are layers and seasons. And I hope we can teach some young people to give a season in their life to public service. Now, I know I've been talking for a long time, and I'll close and take your questions, but I want to leave with one illustration and then one final challenge. And the illustration is simply this. How many years has the earth been in existence? 4 billion back here, 6 billion here. The earth's been around for 5 billion years, give or take a billion. Discover Television says 4.8 billion. I don't think they know, but around 5 billion years. Here's my second question. How many years has human life been on the planet? 10,000 up here? 40,000 back there? 100,000? 50,000? Do I hear 100,000? I don't have a clue. Here's what I do know. The Earth's been around for 5 million years. On or about 1830, we reached 1 billion brothers and sisters on planet Earth wanting access to clean air and clean water. Not 1830. Same time we were doing the gold rush, same time we found oil in Pennsylvania, 1830. We hadn't invented machines yet, but we did find oil. 1830, 1 billion people. By January of 1930, 100 years later, we were at 2 billion people. Why was that? Well, we invented vaccines for children so that children 0 to 5 were not dying, and we stopped death at childbirth, so life expectancy went from 35 to 45 to 50. In fact, in the mid-30s, when Social Security was put in place, the life expectancy for men was about 63, and for women was about 67. And it's continued to rise. But we had 2 billion people in 1930. In January of 1960, when I was still in high school, we reached 3 billion. That only took 30 years to add that extra billion. And then 15 years later, when I was standing next to Peter Rodino and Morris Udall and getting sworn in as a member of Congress, there were 4 billion people on planet Earth. I served 6 terms, 12 years. When the people of Pennsylvania elected me to do something else, I left Congress in January of '87, and there were 5 billion of us. The United Nations says on or about October 15th, 1999, we reached 6 billion people. And what's interesting is as I stand here tonight, it was either last week, or next month, that we reached 7 billion people on planet Earth. But here are the 2 statistics I want you to remember. More than half, 1/2, of all the people who ever lived on planet Earth are alive today. Let me say that again. More than half of all the people who ever lived on planet Earth are alive today. And the second statistic is that 95% of everything created by human hands has been created in the last 100 years. We live in an incredible time. It's not only the acceleration of population, it's the consumption of non-renewable resources. My conservative friends say, Bob, there's 500 years left of oil if you use secondary and tertiary techniques, if you get gas out of the ground, do fracking here and there as they're doing. We've got 500 years. And I say, okay, I'll take your numbers. I don't think they're right, but I'll agree. What right do children born 501, 502, 503 years from now to natural resources that we're consuming? How can we be real stewards of planet Earth if we allow the destruction of our planet? And God, Muslim, Jewish, Christian, Jain, interfaith, God, the ultimate being, is calling us to notice the stains when people get spilled on, calling us to be the disciples and the prophets of this generation. I had a great Old Testament professor, a guy by the name of Bernard Anderson, who wrote a book called Understanding the Old Testament. And he gave us a challenge in class while I was in seminary. He said, go read the Quran, go read the Torah, go read the Old Testament, go read the New Testament. Find me a prophet who ever took a poll to figure out what God's will is. Find me a prophet or a disciple who ever had a majority. And he pointed out that it's always a courageous remnant that makes a difference. Margaret Mead said this all the time. She would come and talk to some members of Congress. She would tell you that it's a handful of people that changes the world. I like that concept of a courageous remnant. It gives me hope that we can, in fact, notice the stains, that we can, in fact, be the leaders that we have been called to be. And we can work together at it. We can take back democracy. That's my full-time job, is to get money out of politics and to make sure that democracy isn't stolen by corporate greed or super wealthy people. And I want to get some members of Congress recycled who have been hired by corporate interest to dilute EPA regulations on clean air and clean water. I want to work for the next 100 years, well, maybe only the next 25 years, on trying to restore democracy. My friend Bill Moyers is right. We need to be a nation of and by and for the people. And you guys here at Hartford Seminary, you can help. You can help create the leaders that we've been waiting for. One final comment. I had two closings I was thinking about, and I'm going to use this one. It sounds a little partisan, but it's not. When the Congresswoman was shot in Arizona, they had a memorial service, and lots of people spoke, but President Obama did go and speak. And he said something that I think we've got to keep remembering. Here's what he said. He said, "That's what I believe, in part because that's what a child like Christina Taylor Greene believed." Imagine, here was a young girl who was just beginning to become aware of our democracy, just beginning to understand the obligations of citizenship, just starting to glimpse the fact that someday she too might play a part in shaping our nation's future. She had been elected to her student council. She saw public service as something exciting, something hopeful. She was off to meet her congresswoman, someone she was sure was good and important and might be a role model. She saw all of this through the eyes of a child, undimmed by the cynicism or vitriol that we adults all too often just take for granted. I want us to live up to her expectations. I want our democracy to be as good as she imagined it. All of us. We should do everything we can to make sure this country lives up to our children's expectations. After hearing that, I penciled some words in the margin. I said, let's unload our guns and reload our brains. Let's invest in public education and civic culture. Let's banish hate from our hearts and hate speech from our mouths. Let's learn to love our neighbors, even when our neighbors are elected officials, regardless of party and ideology. And always remember, we are the leaders we've been waiting for. That's it. Please stand and hold each other's hand for just a moment. It's okay to touch. I'm going to share with you a Franciscan benediction. I think you'll get this connection to what I was saying. May God bless each of you with discomfort at easy answers, half-truths, and superficial relationships, so that you may live deep within your heart. May God bless each of you with anger at injustice, oppression, and exploitation of people, especially the children, so that you may work for justice, freedom, and peace. May God bless each of you with tears to shed for those who suffer from pain, rejection, starvation, and war, so that you may reach out your hand to comfort them and turn their pain into joy. And finally, may God bless each of you with enough foolishness to believe that you can make a difference in this world so that you can do what others claim cannot be done. Amen. Please be seated and think of some really good questions and try to disguise your speeches with a question.